Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second Wednesdays at Noon session of 2023. Today, I am pleased to introduce Drexel University Archivist Matthew Lyons and Archives Technician Simon Ragovin for the session Using the Drexel Archives for University Marketing and Outreach. Before we get started, I want to run through a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording this session, and I will send a link to the video and resources later this week so you can revisit the webinar at your convenience. We also ask that you stay muted during the session. Please enter any questions into chat, and the presentation will last 20 minutes and will be followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. As you all settle in, I also want to mention a few upcoming events that the library has planned. Firstly, we have 6 more Wednesdays at Noon events scheduled for the winter term. The next session on February 15th will explore how to navigate the scholarly communication landscape with Scopus. Then, on March 20th, we continue our annual Scholarship event series. This term, we welcome Professor Caroline Schauer, who will lead a discussion on her research and expertise on climate change and sustainability, including her work making quote-unquote plastic from food waste. I'll drop a link to our events calendar in the chat so you can read all about these exciting events, and we hope to see you there. Now, if we are all set, I'll turn it over to Matthew and Simon. Thank you again.
Thanks for the introduction, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar. So Drexel staff are actually one of our major categories of researchers, usually looking for help with creating content for outreach to various audiences. So we decided to do a webinar aimed at our colleagues across the university, whether they've worked with us before. And our goal is to make future collaborations easier and more fruitful, and also to make the Drexel University Archives more widely known as a resource for Drexel staff. So during this webinar, Matthew and I will provide a brief overview of what the Drexel University Archives does, describe some of the collections that can be especially useful to university outreach efforts, share a sample of our collections, and then some tips to foster successful collaborations with us. So I'm going to turn it over to Matthew for an overview of what it is that we do here.
Thank you, Simon. So Drexel University Archives is the department that's responsible for documenting the history of Drexel University. We collect and preserve institutional records from academic and administrative departments, as well as the records of student organizations, faculty research files and teaching materials, campus publications, student memorabilia, and other materials that represent the university's activities, organization, and culture over time. And the reason that we collect all of these things is to make them available for people to use. University Archives collections are open to the general public, but serving members of the Drexel community is a priority for us. We support scholarly research, the use of archival collections in teaching, and various uses by Drexel staff. Staff often contact us requesting information or images to use in outreach. Supporting these kinds of efforts is a basic part of our job, and we're happy to work with staff to help them find materials that will be useful. And to give you a sense of some of the possibilities, Simon is now going to tell you a bit more about University Archives collections.
So, these are some of the types of material in the Drexel University Archives collections. We have yearbooks going back to the 1890s, photographs from every decade of Drexel's history, showing a variety of subjects. A periodicals collection that includes a near complete run of the Alumni Magazine from 1923 to today, the student newspaper The Triangle, which was established in 1926, and many other student publications, as well as newsletters created by academic and administrative departments. And another type of material that could be useful are press releases, which may not be visually spectacular, but they can be a very useful resource, as I'll discuss a little later on in this webinar. So let's take a look at some of these things that I've described. So here we have yearbooks. So the Lexard was first, the first Lexard was 1912. We have a few earlier yearbooks, including the Eccentric, the 1895 Eccentric is our earliest yearbook. And from the periodicals collection. So we have the first issue of the Alumni Magazine, 1923, issues from 1966 and 2002, a couple issues of the student newspaper, The Triangle, athletic news, an issue from 1938 and one from 1990. By the way, the covers of a lot of the athletic news magazines from the 1930s and 1940s are really cool. And then also we have calendars of student activities, and these are some of the ones from the 1960s, so useful to get a sense of like what students were doing outside of class. And then I'm going to show you a small sampling of the tens and thousands of photos that we have in our collections. And these are arranged in chronological order. And this is, I must emphasize, a very small sampling of all the photos that we have. So this is the first photo, this is the men's basketball team, 1895. A photo of the interior of main building taken in 1899 by alumna Virginia Castleman Carter, or Carter Castleman, and the Drexel Orchestra, 1917. This is Harriet E. Worrell, photo taken around sometime in the 1930s. She was an alumna and secretary to the president for 33 years, and definitely an interesting person in Drexel history. Army Day Parade, ROTC, this was taken in 1942. And here's some engineering students, circa 1950. Cornerstone laying ceremony for the Crease Student Center with President Crease, who was one of the Drexel presidents in the center. We have a lot of photos for events like cornerstone layings, commencements, convocations, things like that. Here is a photo of the 50th reunion of the class of 1967, or sorry, the 50th reunion of the class of 1917, taken in 1967. And this is a chemistry class, circa 1970. Student modeling in a senior fashion show, I think 1976, and Society of Women Scientists and Engineers, 1979. We have lots of photos of different student groups. Here's Haggerty Library under construction. We have lots of photos of buildings and of campus, but I think looking at photos of people is probably more interesting for this webinar. Dr. Eva Finney Fields, the first Black woman to be a dean at Drexel in 1989, and this is in 1979, and this is her speaking during an open house in the 80s. And the National Association of Black Engineers, Drexel chapter, 2003, just to show you that some archival photos are in color. It's not all black and white here. And so hopefully at this point, you're intrigued, you're wondering, kind of, if you haven't worked with us before, how can you use these things? What are some possibilities? So often Drexel staff do some research and get some visuals for social media and medium length articles for Drexel publications, exhibits about Drexel history in different Drexel spaces, permanent artwork for offices, books about Drexel history, research about books about Drexel history using archival material, and sometimes alumni contacts staff across the university with questions that we can answer. And so just kind of, some visual examples. So, okay, here's a tweet. Often, archival material can be useful for kind of noting specific events or times of the year. And then Alyssa Falcone, who is an editor for Drexel News in University Communications, she's done a number of articles based on research in the Drexel University Archives. And here's a recent one about the restoration of main building ceiling. And she used a photo from the archives to show just how closely the restoration is to the original ceiling in 1892. And another often she'll tie, archival material to things that are going on right now. So in October 2020, she did an article based on quotes from students in the yearbook about related to the 1918 influenza. So the quotes and the images come from yearbooks and other archival sources. Recently, the Office of General Counsel moved into a new space, and they wanted to use reproductions of archival images to decorate the space. So a member of OGC staff came to the archives, they looked through some photos, and we scanned them. And here's a few of the photos that they chose. And we hadn't actually had a request like this previously for permanent decor, but I think it's a really cool idea, like a way to kind of use archival material. And then, so to celebrate 100 years of co-op, Steinbright incorporated archival images into their exhibit, celebrating 100 years of co-op that was up in Maine. And also some of the photos in this pamphlet commemorating the celebration are from the archives. And we have copies of the pamphlet in the archives because it all comes in a circle. The program, the Drexel Writers Room, when they moved into the 3rd and 4th floors of Ross Commons last year, for their housewarming event, they put together an exhibit of photos of the history of the building Ross Commons. And Drexel bought that building in 1928. So it's been in constant use by Drexel since then. And then 2 recently published books based on research with Drexel archival material. So Building Drexel, published 2017, based primarily in research using Drexel University Archives material. And then Drexel University Black Alumni Council published a book just last year celebrating Black alumni. And portions of the book are based on research done here on their behalf by Fanny Chu Wong, Executive Director of Alumni Relations, who did a lot to assist UBAC's work on this book. Okay, so how do you get started using University Archives collections to do some research or to get some cool visuals for outreach efforts? So it's important to understand that archives, using archives for research is different in a lot of ways from using library resources. And one of the main roles of archive staff is to guide researchers in using our collections. 3 key differences between libraries and archives that are really important to keep in mind when doing archival research to kind of help you understand how to navigate. So one is that archives are organized by creator instead of by subject. So unlike libraries. So archives contain collections, and each collection was created by an individual, a family, or an organization or group. So for example, the Virginia Carter Castleman Photograph Collection created by the individual alumna. The University Communications Records created by a department, or the Drexel Players Records created by a student group. Family collections are a lot more common, like in historical societies, but we do have collections of Drexel family material created by various members of the Drexel family. Another important thing to keep in mind is that archival collections aren't described at the item level. And by that, I mean that not every single photo and document is listed. It's like if a library catalog had entries for each shelf full of books rather than for each individual book. And so these 2 characteristics make archival research unpredictable. And it can be time-consuming and sometimes surprising. But there's definitely an element of luck and serendipity to archival research. Another thing is that archives contain unique items for the most part. So this means that archivists have to constantly balance preservation of the materials with providing access to them, so that they remain available for researchers decades in the future. And this is why material has to stay in the archives and other measures to kind of try to care for the materials for the long term. But the uniqueness is what makes archival research exciting and worthwhile, and why doing archival research and sharing items from archives can make outreach efforts that much more impactful. And there's different ways you could get started. with your research, you can start by looking at our finding aids and archive space. And there's a link to that on a slide with a list of resources at the end. And so what finding aids are they're guides to collections that describe their contents and how they're organized. But not all finding aids are publicly available yet. And keyword searching finding aids is only one strategy for researching in an archival collection. If you don't find anything yourself in archive space, that definitely doesn't mean that there isn't anything to find that's relevant to what you want. Basically, when in doubt, ask us. You know, if you're not sure how to start or you're not finding what you want. So here's some tips for successful collaborations with us. So these are some questions that we'll ask you if you don't tell us in your initial contact with us. And I really want to emphasize telling us what your time frame is super, super important, especially if you need something soon or you're working to some sort of hard deadline. So it's best to include at least an estimate in your initial contact with us. You can start out vague or uncertain about your goal or your topic, but knowing the time frame is really important for us helping you as well as we can. And then plan ahead and be flexible, because as I mentioned, archival research is unpredictable by nature. It can be hit or miss. We may just not have material about a specific person or from the time period that you started looking at, or the information may be time consuming to find. Like we'll say, there's probably material about that person or that topic in this group of boxes or folders, but there may or may not be time to look through all of that. And you may not find what you set out looking for, or you may find something new, something you never thought to look for. So that's that element of serendipity. And one reason to get in touch well in advance of when you need to complete an article or whatnot is to allow for more flexibility. So, if the initial effort you don't find something useful, we can discuss options with you and make suggestions. And another suggestion is consider making time to visit the archives reading room, because we can do some amount of research on your behalf and we can scan small amounts of material so researchers don't have to come in to look through it. But this is a small department. Matthew and I are 2/3 of the full-time professional staff. And we're working on lots of different things. So sometimes a researcher, to continue their research, they'd have to come in to look through archival material themselves. Now, the advantage to doing the research yourself is you'll spot things that we won't know are useful to you. You may stumble onto material that sparks new ideas, or that's useful for some totally different project that we don't know about. And because archival material isn't organized by subject, because it's not described to the item level, some things you can only find them if someone just looks through the folders. So for example, I was looking through a folder of press releases dated to the 1970s in the University Communications records. And I didn't actually find the thing that I was looking for, but there were a lot of press releases with really cool titles. And the second one was titled, First Woman in Drexel's ROTC Program Joins U.S. Army Medical Service Corps. Now, before that, if someone had asked us who was the first woman in Drexel ROTC, we wouldn't have been able to answer that. And this is the sort of information that can be useful for a variety of outreach, for a variety of research, knowing the first woman to be in Drexel's ROTC program. And of course, press releases aren't visually appealing. They're not very exciting to add to social media. That's not gonna be great on a tweet. But it gave me a name I could search for, Eileen M. Skelly. And I found out that she received a Bachelor's of Science in 1975 with high honors. She received an award from the American Chemical Society and the Charles E. Edding Award, which was, maybe still is, I don't know. It's an award granted to students for service. And so I found photos of her from the Lexard, and you can see, a list of all the student organizations she was part of. And she was clearly a very active student during her time here. And then when I searched her name in our internal database, I found that there's also a project file about her in the University Communications records. That research took me very little time. And with a name and a date range, I could start thinking about other collections to take a look at if someone wanted to do more in-depth research about her specifically. So I'm not going to turn it over to Matthew, talk about kind of, once you have stuff you want to use, like copyright considerations. So here's the slide.
Thanks, Simon. So yeah, copyright is an issue to be aware of anytime that you're publishing materials in print or online or on social media. The Drexel University holds the copyright to a lot of the materials in our collections, and University Archives is authorized to grant permission for the use of those materials. But that's not always the case. For example, we have some materials, some photographs whose copyright is owned by a professional photographer or by a wire service, and then they would be the ones whose permission is required. And sometimes there's a gray area, as with a lot of photos where a photographer is listed, but we don't have information on whether they retained the copyright or whether they were doing work for hire for the university, in which case Drexel holds the copyright. And in those cases, we generally leave it to the discretion of Drexel staff and the departments they work for whether to use the images or not. For situations where we do grant permission, we draw up a permission to publish form or letter documenting that we're authorizing the use of specific collection items for a specific purpose. And this is partly for our own records and partly so that the user has documentation of the permission in case anybody asks a question about it. These permission to publish letters are, it's a routine thing for us to generate. And as long as you have the verbal authorization or agreement, you don't have to wait to get the form before posting the material. This is something that people are sometimes concerned about. As long as you know that it's coming, then you'll have it on file soon enough. And also, we don't charge a fee for use of our materials, except basically in a specific situation, if images are being used for in a for-profit purpose in a non-Drexel publication. In other instances, we allow use of materials for free, but we do ask that there be notice included, courtesy of Drexel University Archives. That's it on copyright.
So that's our presentation, and now Q&A time. So I don't know if any questions have accumulated in the chat. Oh, and also, so this slide has links to some resources, and Rachel will share the PowerPoint and the links in the follow-up email, and also shout out to other archives and special collections within Drexel. And I also, on the final slide, I also do list the titles and dates for photographs that I used earlier, with photographer credits when we know them. And also, if you have questions later, you can reach us at archives@drexel.edu. They can be specific questions, about how can I find this, a photo of this specific person, or more general questions about the archives and what we do.
I see a question in chat. So this is actually two questions. First, will the list of archives be published? Also, what is the general time horizon? For example, will your heads explode if we need something in 1 week?
So 1 week, I was actually thinking about kind of like when we say, plan ahead, like what's our minimum? I would say minimum 1 week, preferably. Like we have done like day before things, but that's when someone wanted a photo and we had an appropriate photo that was already scanned. if you want like, a little bit of research and a couple photos for like a tweet in a week, okay, that's fine. And for bigger projects, I mean, it's hard to estimate because archival research is unpredictable. And also because it's hard to tell, from a researcher perspective, what, if we have material about a relevant topic, so I'd like to be able to, give precise time estimates, but it really depends a lot. And also part of being flexible is, what kind of research strategy is appropriate given the goal and given the time frame. But definitely don't wait to contact us, because then it'll just be more difficult for us to help you.
I think as a general rule, the more open-ended and unspecific the request is, and also the size, the larger the request, if you want a lot of images, the more lead time would be needed. But there are other factors that come into it. Another factor is that 2/3 of our physical collections are stored off-site, so it can take us at least a day, and depending on the weather, maybe several days in order to retrieve materials.
Thank you, guys. I have another question in the chat, and like I said to the direct messenger, we will have the other archives and special collections lists with those links, the ones on the page here. I will send those links out with our follow-up correspondence, so you can directly engage that way. So our next question: do you have a preference? Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, we have a couple questions. That's wonderful. So firstly, when do materials hit the archive? Like, does it make sense to reach out to you for materials from 10 years ago, or is that too recent?
I can take a crack at that, Simon. Yeah. Just it depends. Again, we're pretty current, for example, on lectured yearbooks, and certain other publications, but it often can be a significant lag in terms of how long it takes, and there isn't any there's no automatic system for institutional records coming to university archives. We're really largely at the mercy of staff such as yourselves at departments around the university to take the initiative to transfer materials to us, or to at least contact us to inquire about transferring materials. And so that's a really variable thing. One thing I will say that we are pretty current about is we archive a lot of websites connected with the university, both under the drexel.edu domain, and some that are separate from that, but that are run by Drexel departments. And so for a lot of those, we're pretty current, but that's also somewhat variable, so it's not a guarantee.
And also, part of the definition of archival material is that whoever the creator is, it's not something that they actively need anymore. So in addition to us, in addition to kind of like the lag time from, when it actually gets transferred here, if it ever does, it's also just, we don't have, active records that people are still using, so.
Great, thank you both. I have one last question for now in the chat, and that is, do you have a preference between your team searching for materials, or do you prefer that we come to the archives and search ourselves?
So it depends. So often researchers, they get at least enough of what they need by emailing with us, and maybe we just provide them the information they need. Maybe we scan a few things for them. Sometimes it's a question of, how much information do you want? How much have you gotten enough, just through kind of emailing back and forth with us, and through the amount of research we have time to do, Or do you want to do a deeper dive and look for things that we aren't aware that we, definitely have actually, that sort of thing. So that's part of, planning ahead and being flexible. If it turns out like, again, it varies a lot, but, sometimes if there is a lot of material, it's like we don't have time to go through it. And sometimes, if material is scanty and scattered across lots of different folders and boxes and collections, it takes time to find it. So we would love it if more researchers came in to kind of discover things for themselves. I think archival research it's unfamiliar, it can be kind of confusing, that's for sure. But like our job is to help researchers find what they want. So really, if you're looking at our finding aids in archive space and you're like, what am I even looking at? How do I use this? If you just wanted some idea of whether we have material about kind of a general topic of some kind, I mean, really, like, when in doubt, please ask us. But also, I guess often I think Drexel staff realize that that additional research is time consuming and they aren't able to make the time to do that. But if staff could make the time more often, I think that would be really fantastic. I think that's a great way to find really awesome stuff that, that otherwise we wouldn't turn up. So.
And if I could just add something, there are certain kinds of research that are much easier for us to do than others. So if you have a specific name of a person or a department or an event or something like that, that's going to be much easier for us to do a quick check than if it's something like, who was the first blah blah. Generally, unless we've already gotten the information about who was the first fill in the blank, we're probably not going to be able to answer that because our collections simply aren't organized that way, and they're not indexed that way. Or if you're looking for, an image that has a particular characteristic, but you don't have a name or something like that, then it's somebody's going to have to kind of look through a lot of images and just pick out something based on a judgment. And generally unless it's a slow time, we may not have the staff capacity to do that kind of research unless you give us a long lead time. So that might be an instance where it would really be helpful to have somebody come in and do some work in our reading room.
Great, thank you both again. I believe this concludes our session. I just want to thank everybody again for being here and participating in this with us, and we will again follow up with some correspondence with the event recording, the slides as Simon mentioned, and also the link to these valuable resources. So keep your eye out for that. And with that, I thank you all very much. We will end this session. Have a great day.